Born into luxury, he could have become one of Arabia's most powerful businessmen. Instead, he chose to become the world's most wanted enemy. This isn't just the story of Osama bin Laden. It's the beginning of a global era, shaped by shadows, violence, and a legacy that still haunts us. The man known to history as Osama bin Laden was born on March 10, 1957. For years, the precise location of his birth remained uncertain. Some believed it was in the coastal city of Jeddah, while others claimed Riyadh, the Saudi capital. Today, most historians agree that Riyadh was his actual birthplace. His story, however, begins not with him, but with his father. Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden was born in 1908 in Yemen. At a young age, his family migrated north across the Red Sea region to Western Arabia, an area disputed at the time between the crumbling Ottoman Empire and the House of Saud. In the 1930s, Mohammed began working as a construction contractor. Through grit, timing, and ambition, he caught the attention of none other than Abdulaziz ibn Saud, the founding monarch of modern Saudi Arabia. Under royal patronage, Mohammed bin Laden's company flourished. What started as a modest venture grew into the Saudi bin Laden Group, a powerful and wealthy enterprise in a newly oil-rich kingdom.
Mohammed bin Laden's story reflects the classic narrative of Gulf capitalism, migration, royal favor, and explosive oil wealth. But it also shows how quickly a family can rise from obscurity to elite status. Osama was born into this, not into poverty, but into privilege, entitlement, and immense expectation.
As Saudi Arabia rapidly transformed into the world's top oil exporter, the bin Laden family's fortune skyrocketed. Mohammed, a man who once crossed the desert as a migrant, was now a multi-millionaire, possibly a billionaire by today's standards. In 1956, at the age of 48, Mohammed married Hamida al-Attas, a 14-year-old girl of Syrian descent from the coastal city of Latakia. Her family were successful citrus farmers. She became his 10th wife. Just a year later, in 1957, Osama bin Laden was born, their only child together. However, the union between Mohammed and Hamida did not last long. The couple separated shortly after Osama's birth. Some biographers have speculated that their relationship may have never been formalized under Saudi law, suggesting Hamida may have been more of a concubine than a legal spouse. Regardless of the legal definition, Osama was born into immense privilege. His father, already immensely wealthy, ensured his son lacked nothing materially. Osama grew up in an environment of wealth and influence. He would eventually stand to inherit more than 30 million from his father's estate. After the separation, Hamida married Mohammed al-Attas, a business associate of her former husband. Together, they had 4 children, and Osama was raised in this blended family. Though separated from his biological father, Osama remained tied to the legacy and resources of the bin Laden name. Meanwhile, the Saudi bin Laden Group was becoming one of the most significant corporations in the Arab world. Its ties to the royal family were deeply entrenched. In fact, the company was entrusted with overseeing the restoration and maintenance of Islam's 2 holiest sites, Mecca and Medina. By 1964, they were even awarded the contract to reclad the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, one of the most sacred Islamic landmarks. Despite this deep connection to business and power, young Osama showed limited interest in joining the family enterprise. Friends and acquaintances from his early years recall a boy more drawn to poetry, religion, and Arab literature than construction projects or profit margins. In a world where money was never a concern, Osama was free to explore different paths.
This is a recurring theme we see in radicalized elites, a sense of spiritual restlessness. Osama rejected the materialism of his own family. His identity crisis wasn't born from deprivation, but from the contradiction between extreme wealth and extreme ideology.
At the age of 17, in 1974, Osama married a Syrian girl named Najwa Ghanem. Around this time, he enrolled at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, an institution that would become a turning point in his ideological development. It was here that he came into contact with radical Islamic scholars and preachers. One of them, notably, was Abdullah Azzam, a charismatic Palestinian academic who deeply influenced Osama's beliefs. The world Osama was growing up in was rapidly shifting. The Middle East was in the throes of historic change. Since the fall of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I, the region had become a geopolitical chessboard, with Britain and France carving up former Ottoman lands under colonial mandates. But by the mid-20th century, that influence was waning. The United States was becoming the new power broker in the region, especially following the creation of Israel in 1948. The establishment of Israel, backed heavily by the US, sparked widespread anger across the Muslim world. Armed conflicts flared up repeatedly, the Six-Day War in 1967, and the Yom Kippur War in 1973 among them. These wars left deep scars, not just militarily, but emotionally and ideologically across the Arab world. The Iranian Revolution of 1978 added fuel to the fire. The Western-backed Shah was overthrown, and Iran was transformed into an Islamic republic under the leadership of Ayatollah Khomeini. It was a moment of triumph for Islamist movements, who saw religious rule as a viable alternative to Western-supported monarchies and secular governments. Then, in December 1979, came another shockwave: the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It was a move that changed the trajectory of Osama bin Laden's life. The Soviets intervened to prop up a Marxist regime known as the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA. Facing increasing opposition from Islamic rebels, the regime teetered on collapse. The Soviet military poured in. Tens of thousands of troops, tanks, and aircraft moved to occupy Afghan cities. The invasion triggered outrage across the Islamic world and in the United States.
For many in the Muslim world, the Soviet invasion wasn't just about communism versus capitalism. It was seen as another form of imperialism, this time against Muslim identity. For a young man like bin Laden, raised in religious fervor, this was a personal call to arms.
Osama had just completed his studies, although whether he graduated with a degree remains unclear. What is certain is that almost immediately after the Soviet invasion, he traveled to Pakistan. There, he began laying the groundwork for a new chapter, one that would take him far from the comforts of Saudi palaces and into the harsh mountains of Afghanistan. He was not alone. Volunteers from across the Muslim world began pouring into the region to fight what they saw as a holy war, a jihad, against the atheist communist invaders. These fighters became known as the Mujahideen, which roughly translates to those engaged in jihad. Osama bin Laden was one of them. And he wasn't just a foot soldier. He had resources, charisma, and a growing sense of purpose. By the early 1980s, Osama began using his inherited fortune to fund training camps, build infrastructure, and supply arms for the Mujahideen fighters operating out of Pakistan and infiltrating Afghanistan. His efforts, while significant, were dwarfed by the billions of dollars in covert aid funneled into the conflict by the United States and Saudi Arabia. two Cold War allies who saw the Afghan struggle as a way to bleed the Soviet Union. Nonetheless, bin Laden's presence and financial support made him a respected figure among the fighters. His name was slowly beginning to circulate, not as a businessman, but as a budding commander in a holy war. And this, as history would later reveal, was only the beginning. In the rugged mountains of eastern Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden began to build his legacy, not as a businessman or academic, but as a financier and field organizer in one of the bloodiest conflicts of the Cold War. From his base, Al-Masada, translated as the Lion's Den, bin Laden funded and oversaw the training of Arab volunteers, mostly from Saudi Arabia and North Africa. These foreign fighters were distinct from the native Afghan mujahideen. They were drawn not just by nationalism or tribal allegiance, but by the idea of a pan-Islamic jihad. Though bin Laden's direct military role was limited, his growing reputation came to symbolize a new type of transnational militant, one motivated by ideology more than territory.
The formation of Al-Masada is a perfect metaphor. Bin Laden wasn't interested in temporary resistance. He was laying the physical and ideological foundation for something much bigger. And tragically, he succeeded.
You have to understand, many of these young Arab men weren't poor or uneducated. They were motivated by a romantic vision of jihad, one in which they saw themselves as defenders of the Muslim world against a godless superpower. Bin Laden gave that narrative structure.
In the late spring and early summer of 1987, bin Laden's forces faced their first real test at the Battle of Jaji. This engagement, though militarily insignificant in the grand scope of the war, was heavily publicized, especially in Arab media. Reports of bin Laden's personal presence on the battlefield, braving Soviet shelling, transformed him from a wealthy patron to a revered figure among Islamist radicals. The legend of Jaji helped catapult his status across the Arab world. And with this newfound recognition, bin Laden began thinking beyond Afghanistan. In the years that followed, as the war dragged on, the devastation deepened. The Soviet military unleashed relentless aerial bombardments and scorched earth tactics to dislodge the mujahideen. Villages were razed, civilians massacred. By the mid-1980s, nearly one-third of Afghanistan's population, over 4 million people, had been displaced. Many became refugees in neighboring Pakistan and Iran. Death toll estimates ranged from 500,000 to over 1 million. It was during this time that bin Laden's ideology crystallized. While the West saw the Afghan war as a geopolitical chess move against Moscow, bin Laden saw it as divine proof that faith and determination could overcome a superpower. He came to believe that jihad, armed struggle, was not only justified, but necessary wherever Muslims were under perceived oppression.
The chaos in Afghanistan created a perfect storm: global superpower conflict, regional collapse, and religious radicalization. But most importantly, it showed bin Laden something powerful: that irregular fighters using asymmetric tactics could humble a global empire.
By 1988, as the Soviet withdrawal loomed, bin Laden gathered his most trusted allies and founded a new organization, Al-Qaeda. The name, which means the base or the foundation in Arabic, was chosen deliberately. It was intended to serve as a global network for militant jihadists, a centralized hub for what bin Laden envisioned as a perpetual holy war against non-believers and foreign influence in Muslim lands. From its earliest days, Al-Qaeda's mission was ambitious: to mobilize Muslims globally, coordinate attacks against enemies of Islam, particularly the United States and its allies, and create a new Islamic order through violent revolution. The timing was significant. In 1989, after nearly a decade of war, Soviet forces withdrew from Afghanistan. For the Mujahideen, it was a moment of triumph, and for bin Laden, a validation of jihadist ideology. When Osama bin Laden returned to Saudi Arabia that year, he was welcomed as a hero by many. His role in helping repel the Soviets, however symbolic, earned him praise. Back in his homeland, he reconnected with the Saudi bin Laden group, attempting to leverage the company's resources and political ties for his new goals. But things were changing rapidly across the region. In August 1990, Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded the tiny oil-rich nation of Kuwait. The aggression shocked the world and triggered a massive international response. Within weeks, the United States began assembling a military coalition to expel Iraqi forces, a coalition that included troops from Britain, France, and dozens of other nations. Bin Laden, appalled by the idea of American soldiers setting foot on the Arabian Peninsula, offered his own solution. He proposed to the Saudi government that his Arab Legion, veterans of the Afghan Jihad, could be deployed to defend Saudi Arabia's borders against Iraq. His offer was rejected. The Saudi royal family instead accepted U.S. military protection, allowing thousands of American troops to be stationed on Saudi soil, home to Islam's holiest sites, Mecca and Medina. For bin Laden, this was more than a political decision. It was a religious betrayal. Enraged, he launched a propaganda campaign against the Saudi monarchy, accusing them of desecrating sacred ground by welcoming infidel armies. His criticisms were met with harsh resistance. The government silenced his voice, froze his assets, and restricted his movements. Soon, Osama bin Laden became a political outcast. In 1991, facing growing pressure, he left Saudi Arabia. His next destination would provide him with both sanctuary and space to rebuild: Sudan. Personally invited by Hassan al-Turabi, a powerful figure in the Sudanese government, bin Laden relocated to Khartoum. There, he was given land, security, and relative freedom to operate. He constructed a fortified compound on the outskirts of the capital, surrounded by loyal Al-Qaeda followers armed with heavy weapons. During his time in Sudan, bin Laden lived openly. He ran businesses, he invested in infrastructure and agriculture. But beneath this legitimate surface, Al-Qaeda continued to grow. New training camps were established. Recruits from across the Islamic world were flown in. Financial networks expanded, and bin Laden began plotting the next phase of his jihad. The war in Afghanistan had given him confidence. The rejection by Saudi Arabia had given him resolve. Now in Sudan, he had the means.
In Sudan, bin Laden made a crucial shift. He professionalized jihad. He began thinking like a CEO, creating networks, diversifying funding, identifying global grievances. He wasn't just building an army, he was building an enterprise.
And the targets he had in mind were no longer just local. They were global. By the mid-1990s, Osama bin Laden had transformed from a fringe militant into the head of a rising jihadist empire. From his Sudanese stronghold, he oversaw the growth of Al-Qaeda into a global network. But this sanctuary would not last forever. Under pressure from international governments, including the United States and Saudi Arabia, Sudan's leadership began reconsidering their relationship with bin Laden. His growing list of enemies, combined with increased scrutiny after several terrorist incidents, became a liability. In 1996, bin Laden was forced to leave Sudan. He boarded a chartered flight and returned to a country where chaos reigned and militants flourished: Afghanistan. The timing was critical. That same year, a hardline Islamist movement known as the Taliban had seized control of most of Afghanistan, establishing a new Islamic emirate. Bin Laden was welcomed as a guest of honor by Mullah Muhammad Omar, the Taliban's reclusive spiritual leader. He was given a secure compound and freedom to operate within Taliban territory. Shortly after arriving, Osama bin Laden issued a formal declaration of war against the United States.
This wasn't a rhetorical statement buried in some obscure speech. Bin Laden made it clear he was declaring war on America, on its military presence in Saudi Arabia, and on its unwavering support for Israel. And this time, he meant action.
It was not merely rhetorical. He accused the U.S. of occupying the Arabian Peninsula, desecrating holy lands, supporting Israel's oppression of Palestinians, and backing repressive Arab regimes. His grievances were vast, and his tone uncompromising. Behind the scenes, bin Laden had lost much of his personal fortune. But he compensated through new networks, donations from sympathetic financiers, clandestine business activities, and alliances with other jihadist groups. In 1992, prior to leaving Sudan, bin Laden had allegedly financed the bombing of the Gold Mihor Hotel in Aden, Yemen, an early attempt to target U.S. military personnel. Though it failed to inflict American casualties, it marked a transition in Al-Qaeda's methods, from ideology to action. In November 1997, the world was horrified by the Luxor massacre in Egypt. 6 gunmen opened fire on tourists visiting ancient temples, killing 62 people, most of them Westerners. Though not directly linked to bin Laden, the attackers were part of the broader jihadist ecosystem that Al-Qaeda supported. But it was in August 1998 that bin Laden's name truly entered global consciousness. 2 massive truck bombings struck U.S. embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The coordinated attacks killed 224 people and injured thousands more. The explosions leveled buildings and left bodies scattered across city streets.
From a counterterrorism perspective, this was a seismic shift. Bin Laden had gone from training fighters in caves to executing simultaneous strikes on 2 different continents. It told us we weren't dealing with a local actor anymore. This was now a global insurgent network.
These acts were clear, calculated, and symbolic. Bin Laden was now America's most wanted terrorist. The U.S. responded swiftly. Cruise missiles were launched at suspected Al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan. But the retaliation missed its primary target. Bin Laden survived. That same year, the FBI officially placed him on its 10 most wanted list. Western intelligence agencies around the world turned their eyes to Afghanistan. Yet, even then, the full extent of the threat was not fully understood. In 1999, bin Laden gave his approval to a chilling proposal. An Al-Qaeda affiliate, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, had presented an audacious plan: hijack commercial airliners and use them as weapons against high-profile American targets. The idea was radical, logistically complex, and unprecedented, but bin Laden embraced it. Throughout the rest of 1999 and into 2000, potential hijackers were carefully vetted. Osama insisted on specific criteria: fluency in English, the ability to blend into Western societies, and the emotional resolve to carry out suicide missions.
There's something haunting about how patient bin Laden was. He wasn't in a rush. He saw himself as waging a generational war, and 9/11 was just a strategic chapter in that vision.
Among those selected were Mohammed Atta, Marwan al-Shehi, and Ziad Jarrah, men who would later become infamous. The chosen operatives traveled to Germany and the United States, taking flight lessons, opening bank accounts, and assimilating quietly. They moved through airports and neighborhoods unnoticed, preparing for a day that would shock the world. There's long been speculation about why September 11th was chosen. Some point to the American emergency call number 911 as a symbolic message. But others believe the date had deeper historical resonance. On September 11th, 1683, the Ottoman Empire's siege of Vienna was broken by European forces, marking the end of Muslim expansion into Europe. For bin Laden, who steeped himself in both Islamic history and anti-Western narratives, the date may have been deliberately chosen as a form of symbolic reversal. By late summer 2001, all 4 planes had been assigned. American Airlines Flight 11 departed Boston at 7:59 a.m. on September 11th, carrying 5 hijackers. United Airlines Flight 175 followed shortly after at 8:14 a.m. American Airlines Flight 77 left Washington Dulles at 8:20 a.m. United Airlines Flight 93, the final flight, departed Newark at 8:42 a.m. What followed that day would become the most devastating terrorist attack in modern history. Thousands of lives would be lost. Global politics would shift. Wars would ignite. And Osama bin Laden's name would be seared into history forever. September 11th, 2001. A date that would reshape the 21st century. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. The initial impact tore through dozens of floors, killing everyone on board and hundreds inside. 17 minutes later, at 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 slammed into the South Tower, broadcasting the horror live to millions of viewers around the world. By now, there was no doubt. This was not an accident. It was an act of war. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 hit the western side of the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, the heart of the United States Military Command. Less than half an hour later, United Airlines Flight 93, its passengers having learned of the other attacks, fought back. The hijackers crashed the plane into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. All on board were killed, but the Capitol building, or White House, was likely spared. Back in New York, chaos consumed lower Manhattan. Fires raged in both towers. With elevators crippled, thousands attempted to descend stairwells shrouded in smoke and heat. Above the impact zones, hundreds were trapped. Some jumped to their deaths in desperation. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower collapsed, just 56 minutes after impact. At 10:28 a.m., the North Tower followed. In under 2 hours, the skyline of New York was changed forever. 2,977 people were killed that day, including first responders, office workers, airline crew, and unsuspecting citizens from over 90 countries. The world mourned, and it demanded answers.
The shock wasn't just in New York. From Cairo to Jakarta, the Muslim world held its breath. Many feared what would come next, not just retaliation, but a new wave of suspicion, surveillance, and blame placed on entire communities.
Almost immediately, U.S. intelligence agencies began tracing the origins of the hijackers. Within days, they had identified the 19 perpetrators. All were affiliated with Al-Qaeda, and all had pledged allegiance to Osama bin Laden. The Bush administration acted swiftly. On October 7, 2001, less than a month after the attacks, the United States launched Operation Enduring Freedom. Cruise missiles and bombers targeted Taliban and Al-Qaeda strongholds across Afghanistan. At the same time, CIA operatives and U.S. Special Forces entered the country to coordinate with the Northern Alliance, a coalition of anti-Taliban militias. the Taliban quickly began losing ground. By November, Kabul had fallen. By December, Kandahar, the Taliban's spiritual capital, was captured. But bin Laden had already vanished. U.S. intelligence believed he had retreated to the remote cave complex of Tora Bora in the White Mountains near the Pakistani border. In December 2001, U.S. and allied Afghan forces launched an aggressive assault on the area. Heavy bombing pounded the mountains. Bunkers were raided. Communications were intercepted. But the mountains gave bin Laden cover, and possibly an escape route.
We had him. We were closing in. But the reliance on local militias to block escape routes was a mistake. They were unreliable. And bin Laden, he knew the terrain better than anyone. He was gone before we even realized it.
Despite being cornered, he slipped away. How exactly he managed to evade capture remains a matter of debate. Some claim Pakistani sympathizers helped him across the border. Others believe he escaped through tunnels. What is certain is this: by early 2002, Osama bin Laden had disappeared. Over the next decade, he became the most wanted man on Earth. The U.S. offered a $25 million reward for information leading to his capture. Intelligence agencies pored over leads from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, even Africa. Al-Qaeda operatives were tracked, captured, and interrogated. Some were sent to secret CIA black sites or Guantanamo Bay. Yet bin Laden remained a ghost.
Bin Laden understood the power of symbols. He didn't need to act often. Just by staying alive, he remained a symbol of defiance. The man who had humiliated a superpower and evaded justice.
In his absence, Al-Qaeda continued its operations. The 2002 Bali bombings, the 2003 Riyadh compound attacks, the 2004 Madrid train bombings, and the 2005 London bombings all bore the hallmarks of Al-Qaeda's training and ideology. Still, bin Laden's direct involvement in many of these acts was unclear. His public appearances were sporadic. Grainy videos and audio tapes, often broadcast by Al Jazeera, featured bin Laden issuing threats, praising attacks, and reaffirming his ideology. In 2004, he openly claimed responsibility for orchestrating 9/11, declaring that it was carried out in retaliation for U.S. support of Israel and American troops on Islamic soil. Even so, his whereabouts remained unknown. Many assumed he was living in the lawless tribal regions of Pakistan, protected by local militias or the Taliban. Some believed he was in caves, others thought he had died. But the truth was more surprising, and far more mundane. While American drones scoured the mountains, bin Laden had found refuge in a quiet Pakistani city. He wasn't in a cave. He was in a compound. For years, the world searched for Osama bin Laden in the rugged hills and lawless tribal regions along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. But he wasn't there. In 2009, U.S. intelligence services made a breakthrough. They had been tracking a man known as Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, a close associate of bin Laden who had been present at the Battle of Tora Bora in 2001. Over time, al-Kuwaiti had emerged as a trusted courier, a human link between bin Laden and the outside world. He never used phones, never emailed. His movements were carefully guarded. Eventually, al-Kuwaiti led intelligence analysts to an unusual three-story compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, a quiet garrison town just 75 miles from Islamabad. The house had no phone lines, no internet, and stood out from surrounding homes with its high walls and barbed wire. A single family lived there, rarely seen, with no visitors, no trash collected, and children who didn't go to school.
From a tactical standpoint, it screamed high-value target. And the location? Just a stone's throw from a Pakistani military academy. It raised serious questions about who might have known what.
By late 2010, the CIA was confident. Bin Laden was inside. President Barack Obama and his national security team spent months monitoring the compound. Satellite imagery, surveillance, and human intel all pointed to one conclusion. But confirmation was still elusive. No one had photographic proof. Eventually, a decision was made. On the night of May 1st, 2011, two Black Hawk helicopters lifted off from a U.S. base in Afghanistan, carrying SEAL Team 6, America's elite counter-terrorism force. They crossed into Pakistani airspace undetected and arrived over Abbottabad shortly after midnight. One of the helicopters crash-landed inside the compound due to air turbulence, but the SEALs were unharmed. They moved quickly. Room by room, they cleared the building. In a top-floor bedroom, they found Osama bin Laden. He was unarmed but resisted. A SEAL shot him twice, once in the chest, once above the left eye. He collapsed and died instantly.
The entire operation took under 40 minutes, but it was a decade in the making. Justice came not with fanfare, but with silence in the dark.
The mission lasted under 40 minutes. On bin Laden's body were found 500 euros and 2 phone numbers sewn into his clothing, perhaps in preparation for a sudden escape. But it was too late. Within hours, bin Laden's death was confirmed through DNA testing and facial recognition. His body was transported to the USS Carl Vinson, a U.S. Navy aircraft carrier in the Arabian Sea. There, under Islamic custom, he was buried at sea, a decision made to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine. The world reacted instantly.
The death of bin Laden was symbolic. The world he had helped create of drone warfare, airport security, endless war would continue long after him. If anything, he had become the architect of a new global normal.
Crowds gathered outside the White House, Ground Zero and in Times Square, waving flags and chanting. After nearly a decade of war, fear, and mourning, Americans had found a sense of closure. But the story didn't end with bin Laden's death. Al-Qaeda had been weakened, but not dismantled. In fact, by the time bin Laden was killed, newer and even more brutal jihadist movements were rising. In 2004, a Jordanian extremist named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi pledged allegiance to Al-Qaeda and formed Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI. Zarqawi's tactics were notoriously savage: bombings, beheadings, and sectarian killings. His goal was not just jihad, but total chaos. After Zarqawi's death in 2006, his group evolved. It rebranded, reorganized. By the early 2010s, amid the chaos of the Arab Spring and the civil war in Syria, AQI had become a new force. ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Led by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, ISIS declared a caliphate in 2014, seizing vast territories in Iraq and Syria. It eclipsed Al-Qaeda in both brutality and global influence. Jihadist propaganda now came not from dusty tapes in caves, but from slick videos and viral hashtags on social media. Layla Benis, journalist, BBC Arabic. In many ways, ISIS was bin Laden's ideological child, but born into a darker, more fragmented world. Where bin Laden was secretive, they were theatrical. Where he sought symbolism, they sought spectacle. Meanwhile, in Africa, groups like Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, gained strength, attacking schools, hotels, and public spaces. Across the Sahel, jihadists destabilized nations like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. Even in Afghanistan, where it all began, the Taliban eventually returned to power after the US withdrawal in 2021, bringing full circle a conflict that began in the shadow of 9/11. So, what was bin Laden's legacy? To some, he was the mastermind behind the deadliest terrorist attack in US history, a man whose ideology caused untold suffering and death. To others in extremist circles, he became a martyr, a symbol of defiance against Western power. In truth, Osama bin Laden was both a man and a movement. A man born into wealth and comfort, who turned to violence in pursuit of religious and political goals. A man who reshaped modern warfare, not through armies, but through asymmetric terror. A man who triggered 2 wars, altered global security forever, and indirectly gave rise to groups even more radical than himself. His death marked the end of an era, but the struggle he helped ignite continues, across continents, across ideologies, and across generations.
Bin Laden was not merely a terrorist. He was a historical pivot point, a man who forced nations to redraw their security maps and societies to question their own openness. His legacy is one of irreversible consequences.
What do you think of Osama bin Laden's story? Should he have faced trial instead of being killed? What might justice have looked like in the aftermath of 9/11? Let us know in the comments below, and thank you for watching.